here is the context, right? So Amanda has couples in her database, right? So there's two spouses who have separate contact records because they're individual people, but they have maybe like shared retirement accounts or shared accounts, and so when a note is applied to one contact, we want it to automatically be mirrored on their spouse's contact record as well, so that we have sort of a consolidated history on both spouses, regardless of which one the note was applied to. But we don't want to merge these contacts because they're individual people, and like any relationship, there's a possibility that they may part ways and divorce or what have you, and so we need to be able to separate them and not just consolidate them or just speak to them as individuals occasionally. So I think I have a solution for this. I've been playing with it here, but let me walk you through the recipe, and I will invite feedback or ideas because there might be ways to make this simpler as well. So these are the two contacts that are spouses, and this is contact ID 753, and this is contact ID 9154. So the first thing I did was I made a custom field for spouse ID. 9154, that's the other one, and 753, right? So each contact has their spouse's ID in a custom field on their record. So like this is the other person, right? And this is the other person. And my plan was just to use that as a variable that we look up. But I ran into a snag that I haven't solved yet. So I have a backup method that I'm going to use a Google Sheet for, but my point that I'm making is like you either don't need this spouse ID field or you don't need the Google Sheet. Those are two different ways of accomplishing the same thing of just maintaining that information. But that's all. We'll get to that. So the way that this initiates is with a new contact action. So using the Max Classic integration in Zapier, we have a whole bunch of integration options, and one of them is new contact action, which will trigger for tasks, notes, or appointments. Okay, so that's key here. And then we click continue. We choose the account that we want, and we test the trigger. And I have applied a note to the top contact record here. Test Zapier trigger. This should trigger the Zap, and it successfully did trigger the Zap. So that's the contact action that we are working with here. And like I said, my original plan was just to use that custom field, spouse ID, but for some reason that didn't come through with the Zap. Some of my custom fields did, but the spouse ID field for some reason did not. So if you can get that field to come through, that would be the simplest way to do this. But because it didn't, what I'm going to do is add a step where we use an external spreadsheet and we look up, in this column, we look up the original contact ID, and then we find their spouse ID like that. So the original contact is 753. That's this one. And the spouse ID is 7154. Okay. So I'm going to add that next step. And actually, before we go any further, you could add a filter here to only, like if you only wanted notes to be mirrored between the contacts, you could add a filter that said only proceed if it's a note. But my guess is you probably also want tasks and appointments to be mirrored through because they're going to be important as well. So you may not filter on that. So let's add a different step to look up the ID from that spreadsheet. So Google Sheets. We will choose Google Sheets. We will choose look up spreadsheet row, continue, and we'll choose my Monkeypod Google Sheets account. And we have the spouse ID sheet. So let's see if that shows up at the top of our list here. And it should, because I just created it. Spouse ID, spouse pairs. Lookup column is going to be the contact ID. So that's this column. And we're going to look it up using the value that was found in the first step. So From the first step, we want the contact ID, not the note ID, 56531. That's the note ID. We want the contact ID. And we don't need a supporting lookup column or any of these other options here. So let's click continue. And we'll do test and review. And it finds 9154, which is the spouse ID. So that is good. And then we would do, let's add another step here. So we could add a filter here so that if there's no value, right, if it doesn't find a record, a spouse ID, it like just stops right there. I should call out that you're going to have to populate this sheet manually with your different spouse pairs. And you're going to want to have both versions of them. So 9154 would then be paired with 753, right? So you want to make sure that regardless of if the note is applied to this contact, this is the spouse. But if it's applied to this one, this is the spouse. So you want to have two entries in this table for all for each relationship, right? And like I said, there may be a way to make this simpler, but let's get a version working first. So you would add a filter here so that if no value is found, only continue if, let's see, exists. So only continue if spouse ID exists. Great. And then if we test this, your Zap would have continued. That is perfect. And then the last thing to do here is add a note to the contact record to the spouse. So in Keap Max Classic, action, events, we want to create a note here, and let's choose our Monkeypod account. And then this is where it gets a little tricky, because rather than applying it to like a specific contact, we want to find the contact using an ID, right? So that would be from here, this ID, so 9154, that's going to be this second contact 9154. And we can do, copy, and then we could just merge in the data from that first note, right? So test Zapier trigger. I'm putting copy here because I want myself to know that this is a clone or a copy of an original note, right? Or a mirror, right, of an original note. And then the description would be the same, right? So whatever the information was that was found in that first note, we want to make sure it's mirrored here as well. And the other reason for adding this, right, I might actually put Zap, right, something like that, so that I know this was part of the Zap. But the other reason for doing that would be to use it as a filter so that this doesn't run back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, right? Because if I'm triggering on every note, but the end result is to create a note, I don't want it to start over again and just create this endless loop, right? But let's go ahead and test this and make sure that it applies to the second contact. So that has just run. Looks like it was done successfully. So if we view notes here on this contact, I don't know if it'll show it did right away. So you can see this first one, test Zapier trigger, and then the second one, test Zapier trigger ran there as well. So like I said, we would want to add a step here so that it only continues if the name doesn't include the word Zap, right? So only continue if this does not contain Zap. But, well, it doesn't. The example I used did contain the word Zap. So maybe you would use some other, annotation or some other designation to prevent it. But let's go ahead and turn this on, and then we will test it again. So this should be live, and let's apply a note here to this contact and see if we can get it to map through automatically to the other one. So apply a note. So this would be Amanda test 2. This is the second test, okay? And we'll click save. So that note is being applied, which should trigger the zap. I didn't use the word zap in the title, so it should continue, and then it should look up the spreadsheet row. It should find it was applied to this contact, so it knows that this is the spouse, and then it should only continue if there's a spouse found, which there will be, and then it should apply and mirror that note to the original contact. So now, I will say that I haven't used the note or new action trigger very heavily, so it might not trigger immediately. I know that was the case with tag applied triggers. That's actually one of the benefits to using an HTTP post instead. So I'm going to pause. I'll just relabel this to mirror contact notes, right? But I'm going to pause and just see how long it takes for this zap to run, because so far I'm not seeing any history, and that note has not yet synced through. So it might just need a couple minutes in order for it to show up. Okay, so for some reason it wasn't running, so I just manually triggered this zap, and it looks like it has found and triggered on one on the new note that I had just created. So let's check here and see if that has been applied in Keap against the contact record. There it is. Okay, so that did successfully run. I waited, 5 minutes or so to see if it would trigger on its own, and it didn't. So maybe I just was impatient. But what I ended up doing, because I wasn't seeing the history show up here, there it is. Okay. What I ended up doing was I clicked on Zapier details, and then I saw this option to just manually push it through, which obviously if you have to do that each time would not suffice. But rather than wait 20 or 30 minutes just to see if it's synced, I wanted to make sure that we had the setup done properly, and it appears that we do. That Zap Amanda Test 2 got pushed through after the note was originally applied here. So looks like we've got an option for syncing notes, tasks, appointments across two contacts that have been linked together. Ideally, the spouse ID custom field would, eliminate the need for this external spreadsheet. But like I said, for some reason that wasn't coming through with the test data as I was running it. So a quick workaround was just to maintain a spreadsheet that has those connections in it so that it knows which ID is connected to which spouse, and then they can push the note details back and forth. So hopefully this, solves the problem for Amanda, or at least creates a jumping off point to a solution. But if you have scenarios in your own business where this could be useful, or if you have ideas for how to simplify this process, I am certainly all ears. Feel free to drop any comments or questions below, or share it with anyone who it can serve. Thanks for watching.